And in the ransom note, they even have like specific like you're going to leave the airport in this plane at this time and drop this amount of money, and it's just it's so confusing. It doesn't make any sense.
So they like literally were telling them to just board a normal flight.
I don't know.
Or did they
It
have it
really
rigged somehow? Like, you can't just get onto any airplane and just drop money out the window.
No, you can't.
Also, I hate
You
to
really
break this
can't.
to you, you really super smart dweebos, but once you drop it out of an airplane, you have no clue where it's going to land.
Hi, I'm Chansey.
And I'm Lila.
And this is for Criming Out Loud.
So last week we shared like I literally said pre this recording, I said a geometry fun fact, and obviously that is not it. A geography fun fact. And I have another, just so happened that the interesting thing I saw this week was also geometry related.
You said
And
geometry again instead of geography.
Oh my gosh, I did. Now I got myself all in a tizzle. What a dummy.
In a little tizzle.
A little tizzle over here. No. So the geography fun fact that I saw this week was something I already knew this existed. I just hadn't seen like the numbers on this. So the longest drivable road in the world is the Pan American Highway. And I think this is a pretty well-known thing, but it was really mind-boggling because I was scrolling on the Facebook and I saw like a picture of this highway, and it literally goes from like the top of Alaska all the way to the very, very bottom of South America. Like the very tip.
Of South America?
Yeah, you can drive that. You can drive from Alaska all the way to the very bottom of South America.
I thought you were going to say like Central America. I didn't know you could do that.
No,
That's on my bucket list now.
I know. It's it goes through 14 countries and it's 29,825.187 miles.
Wow. A trek of a lifetime.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I didn't know that existed.
Nuts? I like had heard of it before, but I'd never like really like seen it, and I was like, holy cow. So next time you really want to commit to a road trip, you can go through 14 countries and go 29,000 miles and see like a lot of country. So
all that the Americas have
list.
to offer. Sounds cool. Fantastic, honestly. Maybe I'll just run away from life, and that's what I'll do. I'll just get in my car that doesn't work, and I'll just start at the tip of Alaska and go all the way down. Down, down, down.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be crazy. Like, literally, I'm going to do it someday.
That's, like, seems more fun than that, but also it seems pretty terrifying, because, like, what if you break down in Mexico or something? What are you supposed to do then?
Yeah, seriously. That's 29,000 miles you'd put on a car. Like, that's a year's worth of miles.
Oh, that's just one way.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Then you got to get back to wherever you live.
Yeah. So
maybe it would be better to start at the bottom. I don't think that works, though. Because then you have to, like, if you live in America, for instance, then you have to drive all the way to the bottom and then go to the top. Or
fly there and have your...
Fly to Alaska, buy a car. Because I feel like, I don't know if you can buy a car in South America. Like, you can buy a car in South America, but I feel like that's more complicated. So you'd have to fly to Alaska, buy a car, drive it all the way, and then just ditch it down there so you could fly back.
Can you imagine buying a car in a country where you don't speak the language?
No, I really can't.
How terrifying would that be?
That would be horrible.
You have no clue what they're saying, and then you sign off your entire life.
Then you just sign like a contract.
And it's like, oh, well, I didn't know what you were saying, sir. Yeah, no
idea. Wow,
I don't know. All I know is like that's a commitment to miles on your car. You know, you never think about miles until you become like an adult, and then all of a sudden it's like those are precious, and 29,000 of them. That's a like, life on your car.
That's like a
So,
third of the lifetime of your car just for one trip.
yep,
I don't know if that's
commitment.
worth it. I
But
don't know
there
if
you
that's
go.
worth it. That was kind of an interesting start because my case actually does have something to do with transportation, sort of.
Wow, how did
So,
I know? Just so good.
Lila, you're just a genius. So, today I'm going to tell you about the 1976 Chowchilla Bus Kidnapping. And that's
Chowchilla.
Chowchilla. I have to say that pronouncing Chowchilla is really hard because I keep saying either Cowchilla or Chinchilla, which are both very wrong. So
Yeah.
if you hear me
I get that
say
though.
that, don't
Chowchilla.
be uh don't be too mean. Chowchilla just seems a little bit too chutchy. Anyways,
Ch-ch-ch-ch.
cha-cha-cha-ching. All right, so Chowchilla is in Central California. It's on like the southern-ish side of Central California in Madera County. And nowadays, it's known for the Fossil Discovery Center of Madera, which has things like mammoths and other cool fossils. And then it's also home to 2 prisons. It has an annual giant cattle drive that has like famous rodeo people come and participate in this cattle drive. And it's
Okay.
close-ish to Yosemite National Park. So there's
Okay.
just a random. Apparently, we're obsessed with geography. I thought I'd just give you a little rundown on
There you go.
Chowchilla.
Now you know.
So now you know that's what Chowchilla is known for these days. But back before the 1970s, Chowchilla was mostly known for farming and literally not much else until this incident that we're going to talk about in 1976. And then they would become an internationally known place, which is kind of crazy. So in 1976-ish, Chowchilla had about 4,500 people living in it, which is a very small town. I think most places have at least
I
20,000
think.
people living in them.
Yeah, I could
Well,
say that's small.
Chowchilla has like 19,000 people living in it now. So for the comparatively, the 4,000 people is not very many people. Um, Lila lives in a small town that I won't name, and I looked up the population of her small town, and it's like 3,200 people.
Yeah, that's what I was
So
gonna say. I was gonna say that feels about what I live in.
yeah,
And
it's small. It's
everybody
very
knows
small.
everybody.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of community we're talking about. Like everybody knew everybody. And it was like one of those places where you don't lock your doors and stuff at night because everybody's just safe
Unless you're Lila
until they're not.
and you are terrified of literally every creak in the night.
Yep.
And you make sure all windows are double locked and doors are double locked. That's all.
Because you know that the people that least suspect it are the ones that are vulnerable to these
Exactly.
sorts of situations. But luckily for Lila, this is not a home invasion story. Like I said, this is a bus kidnapping. So
Yeah.
let's move into it. It was Thursday on July 15th of 1976, and Ed Ray was doing his job. He was a bus driver.
Eddie Ray.
Ed Ray. I think his name is actually like something Edward Ray, but he goes by Ed, so I'm just gonna call him Ed because
You know
that's
what
way
I think
easier.
of every time I hear the name Ray?
What?
I think of the little lightning bug in Princess and the Frog.
Oh yeah, good old Ray.
Yep.
Ray and
Little
Evangeline.
Ray. Yep. And it warms my heart a little bit. So there you go.
Me too. He's a cutie. Doesn't he die at the end of that movie?
Yeah, he gets smushed. It's really sad. But he goes and
That's
he
so
goes and
sad.
joins Evangeline in the heavens.
You're
So
right. He joins his love. Okay. I just remembered how depressing that was. All right. Ed Ray, not the lightning bug, but the bus driver, was driving 26 students home from a summer class trip. The kids were like 5 to 14 years old, and they'd all been chilling at the Chowchilla Fairgrounds swimming pool for the day.
okay.
Woohoo. And they were, it was like 4 p.m., and they were on their way home. And all of a sudden, a van drove by and cut the bus off and blocked the road off completely so that Ed couldn't drive around them. And as Ed watched, he's obviously put the brakes on, stopped. And as Ed watched, the van doors opened and out came 3 men, and all of them were wearing nylon stockings to hide their identities.
What? Like over their faces?
Yeah, over their faces. If you've ever seen a picture of somebody doing this, it's actually really creepy. It like smushes their face and it makes them really scary looking. You should look up a picture of it while you're listening, just so you know what I'm talking about. It's a thing that bank robbers have done.
I feel like I've seen it before.
It's like a more economic way to like use a mask. You don't have to like buy a mask, like a ski mask. You can just get nylons. I don't like it. It makes people look faceless almost, like they're mannequins. So these nylon masked men walked towards the bus and got on, and they pointed a gun at Ed, and they forced him to move away from the driver's seat into one of the other seats on the bus. And then the men hijacked the bus. One of them drove the bus. Another one continued to keep the gun pointed at Ed. And then the last man left the bus and drove the van that they'd used to block the bus. And this guy followed them in the van.
Oh my gosh.
So I don't know if that made a ton of sense.
Why would you want to kidnap a bunch of children? Ransom money?
There ain't no good reason. I don't know why I said that, but the motivations, there's never a good enough reason to do that.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. Imagine a bus full of children.
For little kids.
They're little kids. Like a lot of them were under 10 years old. Like that's not good.
Yeah, that's scary.
It's really scary. So the kidnappers drove for like about 7 miles out of town to this place called Barinda Slough that was like by the Chowchilla River. And it was like through some tall bamboo, and there was this like shallow hidden area that was like by the river. And they drove the bus down into this little area and they hid it there. And they'd hidden another van there. So there were now 2 vans and a bus in this like little area. And once the bus was parked, the men backed the 2 vans up to the bus door, and they forced all of the children and Ed to jump from the bus into the back of the vans so that they wouldn't leave any footprints on the ground.
Gee. That's intense.
Yeah.
They thought this out.
It was intense. They did. I don't know. They weren't very smart, and we'll get into it, but they did think it through. It's one of those things where it's like, I'm not really sure why they didn't want to leave footprints.
Like it was pretty obvious that they all got out of the bus, but
and we'll talk about it later. But they didn't like get rid of tracks from the cars, so that the police knew that they'd backed vans up to the bus doors, and that's where the children had most likely gone. So I don't really know.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyways, whatever. So it's like seems smart because it's like, oh, no footprints, but then you think about it and you're like, that's actually kind of dumb that they went to all this extra effort for like something that didn't really hide anything that they were doing. So whatever. No. Don't know what they were thinking.
Not super helpful. No.
Not super great. They do a couple things like that I'm just like, that just doesn't make sense. So one of the girls, Jody Heffington, she was 10 years old at the time, and she later recalled the moments being like before being forced into this van. She said, quote, "He held a shotgun to my stomach, and I had to stand there with this gun in my gut until that one van drove away and they backed the second van up. It felt like forever. I thought he was going to shoot me. I actually did." End quote. So they're like pointing guns at children throughout this whole process.
Yeah.
So
super stellar human beings.
They're garbage humans. And the inside of these vans, they'd been turned into basically like makeshift prisons. The kidnappers had installed wood paneling over the entire interior of the van, and they'd painted over all the windows. So there was basically no light in or out, and nobody could see in or out. And there was no air ventilation of any kind. There was no food, no water, no toilets, nothing. Just like black space. So once all of the children and Ed were loaded into these vans, the kidnappers closed the doors and they left the bus behind hidden in this weird alcove thingy. And they drove for 11 hours with the children and Ed basically packed into these vans like sardines.
Holy cow. Just to go back to the windows being blacked out, isn't that illegal?
I don't know
Or
if it
is it
was in the
only
70s.
front windows?
I think it might only be front windows because I still see like plumbers or handy sorts of vans. They have
but they don't have like
paint
seats
over
back there.
Yeah, but there's no way that you'd know if they did or not.
Yeah,
I don't think it's illegal.
That's true. I just wanted it to be illegal so they'd get caught
You'd
quicker.
You'd think. But no. Especially back in the 70s, I don't think that was something that was a law if it is now. But
okay, so 11 hours in these crappy vans. That's a long freaking time.
Yeah, it is a long time, especially for kids.
Yeah.
So obviously, most of the kids were crying and whimpering, and some of the older kids were trying to keep everybody calm. And everyone was hot because it's the middle of summer in California, and there was no airflow. So they're all just literally dying. And one of the victims, Jennifer, she would later say that she said it felt like that she was an animal being taken to slaughter. Like they all just this impending sense of doom that they were going to die.
Yeah, you would feel that way.
Which is just terrible. Yeah. So eventually, after almost 12 hours, the vans pulled off of the smoother roads and drove on some rough terrain, and then eventually stopped. And they would later find out that they had been taken to a rock quarry called California Rock and Gravel Quarry in Livermore, California.
Why?
Yeah. Oh, it's bad. If you thought this was bad, it's about to get worse. Livermore, California was about 100 miles from Chowchilla. So just think about that for a second. They've been in these vans for almost 12 hours to drive 100 miles. Let me tell you, I drive from northern Utah to eastern Idaho frequently. It's about a 170-mile drive, and it takes me max 3.5 hours. Max. And that's almost double the amount of time, like the amount of distance they traveled. So what were they doing for those 11 hours? They were just driving around for no reason. Yeah. They took like a weird non-direct route. Which again is like, if you're trying to cover your tracks, that doesn't really do anything.
Did they make a lot of stops? Did they?
No stops. They drove continuously for almost 12 hours.
My gosh. That's bizarre.
That's weird. Anyways, I don't know why they thought that was a good idea or what they were trying to accomplish, but it didn't really do anything. So, once they stopped at this rock quarry, the children and Ed were forced out of the vans one by one and sent down a ladder into a hole in the ground.
No. Nope.
Yep.
No, thank you.
Yep.
I'm out.
Yep.
Leave me in the van, please.
Oh, yeah, seriously. Please just keep me here. I'll stay in the van. As they were ordered into the hole, the kidnappers wrote the name and age of each child on a Jack-in-the-Box hamburger wrapper. So they just wrote everybody's names and ages down.
Okay.
So not great. Michael Marshall, he was one of the oldest kids. He was 14 years old. He was with 5-year-old Monica Artery, and they were the last two people left in the vans. And Michael later recalled that he couldn't stand the thought of handing Monica over to them because they didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what was going to happen to her if he handed her over to them. So he was like, I'm going to go first. And so he said, quote, I had to take her hands from mine and rip and tear them apart and tell her it would be okay and go with them and leave her. That was hard, end quote. It was like, understatement, sir.
Yeah.
So this 5-year-old is just left alone
terrible.
in this van by herself, not knowing what's going on. So once the hostages were all inside the hole, the kidnappers removed the ladder, covered the hatch, it was a man-made hatch, and they were basically like, they descended into pitch black darkness. And the children could hear the men burying the opening, like throwing dirt onto the opening that they'd just closed. Basically burying them alive.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's not good.
I feel like when I say this, that I've said this about everything, but this too is my worst nightmare.
I know.
First off, I hate being in pitch black.
Same.
Even when I sleep,
the worst.
Even when I sleep, I have some kind of a muted light on somewhere. I basically am a full-grown adult that sleeps with a nightlight still because I don't do the freaking dark. It's terrifying.
I don't do the darkness.
But then
it's scary.
I'm also claustrophobic. Okay, and so in the dark, in a
like
small
a
hole in the ground that is now covered. No, I'm okay.
Completely encompassed in dirt.
No, I'm okay. Leave me
buried
out of this,
alive.
This is
it
terrible.
was later learned that the hole that they'd been forced into was actually the inside of an old truck trailer that they had buried 12 feet underground.
What in the world are these psychos doing?
Yeah. And if the image like that you're
that
like,
takes
I'm gonna
so much effort. Like so much effort.
It really does.
And for why?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. So I'm going to post, just for everybody's information, I'm going to post the pictures that we're about to talk about on Instagram. So if you want to like go look at what the conditions were like in this trailer, you can. But this was the inside of the trailer. So just to describe what's going on here, there was like wiring along the walls and the ceiling. I'm not really sure what the purpose of it was. Maybe to like reinforce the ceiling. I have no idea. The interior, like the entire interior of the trailer was covered in dirt. Just covered in dirt. Which makes sense because they were buried underground, you know. There were mattresses stacked on the floors, as well as some type of material like sheets or towels or something. I can't tell from the picture, and I couldn't find any information on it. Another gross detail is that they turned the wheel wells of the tractor trailer into basically like small toilets.
Yeah,
if you can even call them that.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's not great. It's not hygienic at all, you could say. There were also containers filled with water, and there were boxes of cereal and jars of peanut butter and loaves of bread, and that was about it. And there wasn't very much of that. Definitely not enough to feed them for very long. And they had also 2 ventilation pipes that were like built into the trailer that allowed for a little bit of airflow.
Oh, so obviously not very much. In there.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't, but I don't know. Like, these aren't like giant ventilation systems. It's just like natural airflow. So it's not like forcing air into the trailer. It's just like there's some ventilation, but it's still not great.
Yeah.
But the worst thing about this situation was first the heat, because like I said, it's like California in July, so it was sweltering. And the second is that the roof of the trailer was like caving in.
Yeah, I noticed that immediately.
It was not
in the pictures.
Stable at all.
It was the first thing I noticed.
They like put reinforced like wood to try and get it to stand up, but it was like half baked at best.
No, it's
It's
about to
like,
collapse.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
no,
literally about to
it's
collapse in. There's
not
like
doing well.
no other way to say it. One of the girls, Linda, would later say, quote, "It was like a giant coffin for all of us," end quote. Which is true. I would be thinking we're totally dead.
Well, you know what's
There's
wild
no
about
way.
this is there's like no light in here.
Yeah, no, it's completely dark. They're just
Like what
in the dark.
what are they expecting them to do? Like
Yeah.
it's a miracle they even found food or, anything.
Yeah. And like eventually your eyes adjust a little bit, but if there's no light, there's no light. So
Yeah.
there's only so much you can see. So basically, the kidnappers seem to have kind of planned for the children and the bus driver to be there for a while,
That's what it
with the
seems
food
like.
and the water. But after 12 hours of them sitting there in the dark, things were getting pretty dire. The stench of vomit and waste filled the trailer. They were basically out of food and water. And it was pretty clear that they might die down there if the kidnappers didn't come back, if they even bothered to come back at all. They didn't know what the plan was. They thought they were just going to rot there. So, Ed, good old bus driver Ed, he was scared of trying to open the hatch because he thought that even if they did get through the hatch somehow, there would be somebody waiting for them up there and that they could potentially like get hurt if they tried to leave. But they didn't know for
Yeah.
sure,
Okay, that's a
which
valid
is
fear, I guess.
makes sense. But Michael Marshall, our 14-year-old, he was willing to risk it. He said later,
We're gonna die
quote, "I
anyway.
thought to myself," literally, he said, "I thought to myself, if we were going to die, we were going to die getting the hell out of here."
Good
And I
for
was
him.
like, good
That's
for
some
you,
courage.
Michael. He really was. He was the hero in the story. Um, Michael stood on top of mattresses that they'd stacked underneath the hatch, and he just pushed as hard as he could against the hatch to try to open it, but it hardly moved at all. And he later said that like all the kids were like cheering him on as he tried to do it,
Yeah,
but he
I know,
couldn't
that's
do
what
it
I
by
was like
himself.
imagining.
Yep, they're all just like, "You can do it, you can do it." So Ed got up on the mattresses and helped him push it open. And eventually they were able to. And the reason it was so hard to push open was because there were two huge 100-pound batteries that they'd placed on top of the hatch to make it like pretty impossible to get the hatch open. So they finally were able to just like push the hatch open, and the batteries like fell through into the trailer, almost like squishing them basically.
Gee.
And at this point, Michael climbed through the hole and discovered that he was not quite to freedom yet, which is the worst. He was actually in a large plywood box that seemed to have been buried, just like everything else. So there was just more dirt, just more and more dirt. But instead of giving up, Michael just started digging around the dirt seal at the bottom of the box to try and break it open. And then he just started digging. It took him almost 4 hours to dig up to the surface,
Like, and I'm
but after a
assuming all
while,
he's got to use is his hands. He's
yep, he's
just
just got
like
his
pawing.
hands. Yep. This is Michael and Ray. Go look at pictures of them. Michael looks like a really cool kid. Just gonna
He
put that out
honestly
there.
does. He looks like he definitely has his life together.
Yep.
He looks like I'm not gonna be beat by some buffoons wearing nylons.
Yeah. He honestly looks like he'd fit in with the cast of Stranger Things. Like, really.
Yeah. Yeah, basically.
For sure. So he keeps digging, takes him about 4 hours, but eventually he makes it to the surface, and there's light finally, and all the kids are like super excited. Um, Michael sticks his head out of the hole he just dug, and he doesn't see anybody, and he saw that they were like in the hills somewhere. And after being buried alive for 16 hours, all of the hostages climbed their way out of the underground prison, and they started walking towards the rock quarry they could see in the distance. So
Okay.
crazy.
So now what do they do? Because they're freaking 100 miles away.
Yeah.
from their freaking home. I
Luckily,
mean, I know they can find civilization, but holy cow.
yeah, yeah. So luckily, it's a Friday, so people are working at the quarry. It's about 8 p.m. on July 16th, a day later, the day after they've been kidnapped, and they walk up to the rock quarry, and they're greeted by shocked workers who immediately call the police. So that's good, at least. They get police help. Police come and they assess the situation and they decide that instead of taking survivors to a hospital, they're going to take them to the closest place that was big enough to hold all of them, which apparently was a local jail called the Santa Rita
What?
Rehabilitation Center.
Are
Yep.
you kidding me? These
I'm
kids
not
have
kidding.
just been through like the most trauma a person can imagine. And you're going to
Oh,
go
yeah.
stick them in jail now?
Oh, yeah. And not only that, but they have to take a bus to get to the jail.
Of
So
course
that
they
all
do.
these kids have to get onto a bus to get to the jail, which I'm sure was traumatizing. And then when they get to the jail, they're given like little prison jumpsuits basically to wear because they don't have anything else available for them. And then they're given apples and soda to eat. And then they all take turns being examined by doctors and then being interviewed by police. And it takes about 4 hours to get through everybody. And they all just have to sit there before they're
And
able
I'm
to go home.
sure they called their parents, right? Because
Yes,
these
they
kids
did. They
have
let them know that they'd been
good.
found.
Holy
Yeah.
cow.
Yep. And then when it was time to go home, the children were then again loaded onto a bus and driven home to Chowchilla. Which I understand that, like, the only way to transport that many people is a bus. But it really must have been, like, terrifying for them to have to
Yeah.
get back in a car in an enclosed space like that. So, that whole thing has happened. Back in Chowchilla the previous day, um, parents were freaking out. An hour or two after like this whole thing first took place, that was when the parents started to realize that something was wrong because their children weren't back from their day of fun at the swimming pool. And so obviously parents start panic calling police, and police were informed that literally a whole bus full of children was missing, and parents started helping police kind of retrace the school bus route, which was like it covered dozens and dozens of rural roads. So it took forever. It took them hours. And eventually they found the bus hidden in a spot 7 miles outside of town. And when they got to the bus, obviously it was empty. And like I said earlier, police could tell that the vehicle, like the vans, had been backed up to the doors of the bus, and they immediately were convinced it was some kind of mass kidnapping. So I
Wow.
don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. The terror that must have, like, I can't even imagine being a parent.
Oh, yeah. It was horrible.
It's a
I
different
just,
kind of awful, but almost as bad of an awful as like the kids, because you just don't know. It could be anything,
yeah, you
And
don't know
especially if
why
I
they've
was
been
them,
taken or if they're
yeah, I would just
alive.
assume the worst. I just assume that, that they've been taken and will never be back.
Well, yeah, especially because, like, there's no, like, no communication from the kidnappers. Like, you don't know what's happened or where they've gone or why
Yeah.
they've been
It
taken. A lot
wasn't
of
like
times
a
kidnappers,
ransom call.
yeah, exactly.
None of that.
So luckily, the sheriff realized he was in way over his head with this, and he called the governor of California and told him, "You need to send some people to help because we don't have the resources to deal with something like this." So luckily, 30 FBI agents were called in to start investigating and figuring out what was going on. And meanwhile, the parents were all told to assemble in the local fire station and just wait for news. And it took, like we said, it took about 30 hours for them to get any news. But eventually they heard that their kids were safe, and obviously they were relieved. But at this point, that's when the FBI takes over and they start investigating and trying to figure out what the heck happened here.
Yeah,
Like,
who the
what
heck are
was
these
happening?
stupid people
Yeah,
kidnapping a
exactly.
busload of children?
So they started with the area where the hostages had been held in the rock quarry, and they started photographing everything and photographing the children as evidence. And eventually they unearthed the truck trailer that the hostages had been kept in, hoping that it would lead them to the men who had done this. But it didn't really give them any solid leads. The FBI then started investigating a man called Frederick Newhall Woods IV.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very
His name,
prestigious.
yeah, that his name is so fancy because he was basically like a descendant of two of the most wealthy people in California, families in California at that time. So Newhall and Woods were both very wealthy families in California, and he was related to both of them. He was 24 years old, and he was the son of the owner of the California Rock and Gravel Quarry, which is where the kidnapped victims had been buried. And an interesting thing that they discovered was that Woods had the keys to the quarry, and basically he had access to the entire whole thing and the equipment and any facilities. So anything that he wanted to use, he had access to. Um,
Convenient.
Yep. And there were security guards at the quarry who had seen three men digging in like this area
I
where the
mean,
trailer was buried.
yeah, would make sense. You
Yep.
can't just do that and have nobody notice.
Yeah.
That's that is
Apparently,
a project.
and this took they did they saw these three men digging months before the kidnapping took place.
Oh, I'd have to assume.
So
That's how long it would take
like
to
it would take
do
forever.
that.
Yeah, even with equipment, that would take a long time. Obviously the security guards had no idea like what was going on, or else they probably would have said something. Um, the FBI also found that Woods had two friends, James and Richard Schoenfeld, who were ages 24 and 22. And these three together had already been convicted of motor vehicle theft, and they'd had to serve probation for their crimes. So they were kind of like a little team. They were all three of them from very wealthy families. So, with all of that information, the FBI, they decided to get a search warrant for Hawthorne. Hawthorne was a 78-acre estate in Portola Valley, and it was owned by the Woods family. So, that's where Frederick Woods lived.
So, did they
They
have anything else to go on at this point, or just these
no,
dudes have done some sketchy stuff? One of them has access to the quarry. This is our best lead.
that was
That's it.
basically it. That was it.
Okay.
But not for long, because like I said, they get the search warrant for this estate, and immediately in Wood's room, they found journals, maps, plans, receipts for the vans and the trailer that had been used to do the kidnapping, fake IDs, one of the guns used in the kidnapping, a draft of a ransom demand, and the final nail in the coffin, the hamburger wrapper, which had all the names and ages of the kidnapped children listed on it.
Wow.
They found
Really
everything.
intelligent.
They
Yeah.
found
Really
everything.
intelligent. It's
When the
good.
hamburger wrapper was tested, they found fingerprints of two of the three kidnappers on the wrapper. So
They nailed
basically,
them.
they nailed him. They didn't seem to try to hide any of the evidence. I don't know what they were thinking, but they just ditched it all. So the notes they found in Wood's room, basically these notes went over plans to have a ransom drop. And this is so confusing to me because there's not a ton of information out there about this like ransom plan, because they never did it. But apparently, they were going to have ransom money dropped from a plane into the Santa Cruz Mountains at night, and they were going to retrieve it while it was dark.
What?
And that's like
Who in the
that's the
world
most
is
I know about the plan.
dropping ransom money from a
Yeah.
plane?
It's pretty wild.
That's far-fetched.
This is like the plan. They have it like all laid out. And in the ransom note, they even have like specific like you're going to leave the airport in this plane at this time and drop this amount of money, and it's just it's so confusing. It doesn't make any sense.
So they like literally were telling them to just board a normal flight.
I don't know.
Or did they have it
really
rigged somehow? Like, you can't just get onto any airplane and just drop money out the window.
No, you can't.
Also, I hate to
really
break
can't.
this to you, you really super smart dweebos, but once you drop it out of an airplane, you have no clue where it's going to land.
Yeah.
It could be
there are a lot of
miles
factors.
away.
Like, you're not going to be able to know where it is.
And in the mountains? Are you kidding me?
And in the dark. How are you going to find it in the dark? That was like one of the main points of their plan, is that it needed to be dark. Okay.
Yeah, obviously, so they could go find the money that they'll never find because they dropped it out of an airplane into the freaking mountains.
Exactly. So clearly, like, they really thought things through, but they were just dumb. Like, they had all these things that were just silly. Anyways, the FBI also found in all of this stuff that they found in Wood's room, they found a receipt for a rental contract at a storage facility. So they obviously went to the storage facility, and they found both of the vans that had been used to transport the victims and another vehicle that had been spray painted black, which I saw in a couple articles described as a getaway car, but I'm not sure at what point in the plan they were going to use it to get away. I don't know. Maybe they were going to use it to find their money because it's dark.
Gotta blend into the night.
Yeah, I don't know. So anyways, they found all of this evidence. These people literally, they didn't try to hide anything or cover their tracks at all. So the FBI issued warrants for their arrests basically immediately. And turns out they were all on the run. They were on the lam. 8 days after the kidnapping, Richard Schoenfeld voluntarily surrendered to authorities. He gave himself up. And then 2 weeks later, James Schoenfeld was caught and arrested. And then later that same day, Woods was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada.
Wow.
He was clearly trying to flee the country, and he did a pretty good job. He was in Canada. Like, he made it before he got arrested.
He's probably really did. Nobody knows me here. I'm in a new country.
I honestly hope he thought he had made it. I really hope he did, and then had to have that shattered. So now with all three men in custody, police were trying to understand like what happened here, like what the motivation was behind this, because it didn't seem to them that they'd gained anything from doing this. So the motivations came to light that they were going to ransom the children. That was the plan. James Schoenfeld later said
took
that
him long.
Yeah.
You don't have like wait like 48 hours to give a ransom note.
I don't.
Nobody believes you kept the kids alive at that point.
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you what happened, because they did try to get the ransom money. So what happened was on July 16th, they got back from kidnapping and everything and hiding all of the like the vans and stuff in the storage facilities. And they planned on calling the Chowchilla Police Department and demanding a $5 million ransom, which is about $26.8 million in today's money. And they weren't able to get through to the police department because the phone lines were jammed with calls from parents and media and all sorts of things. So
Oh
they
my
literally
gosh.
tried to call multiple times and they weren't able to get through. And so they decided that they'd call back the next day. And since they were tired from all of their evil kidnapping, they were just going to take a nap.
Yeah.
So they
Right.
slept.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
The fact that these monsters could put their heads on their pillows and sleep while they knew that 26 children and a bus driver were buried underground and potentially dying in a tomb that they'd built is just horrible.
Yeah.
Like these men, they had zero cares. These men did not care about these kids. They didn't
You know
care
what's
if they got
honestly
hurt or
funny though?
not.
I mean, I don't think they did care, but what's funny to me is that they actually tried to, like, I don't think they actually wanted to kill them though, because they
No,
actually
I don't think
tried
they
to keep
wanted
them
to.
alive. Like they fed them, they thought about the fact that they would need a toilet, and they
Yeah,
had like mattresses in there.
for sure.
So it's not like they just like stuck them in this box underground and were like, there was like enough forethought that they were like, yeah, we're gonna like make sure that they live.
Yeah.
They probably
And
didn't
then,
want any of them to die, but they were just stupid enough to not realize what people actually need to stay alive.
yeah. Well, the other thing, though, to think about here is like, say that you're really desperate and you just need money, which, like, apparently these guys were in a lot of debt even though they came from very wealthy families. They hadn't come into their trust funds yet, and so they were in a lot of debt. James Schoenfeld later said, quote, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back. They're vulnerable. They will mind," end quote.
Yeah, you terrible. No.
That's
Yeah,
so
they're
disgusting that he
they're
said that.
evil and terrible.
Yeah. So it's like, yes, they didn't like intend to hurt, like physically harm them that much,
But they
but
didn't care
also
about them. I
like
mean,
they
obviously.
didn't care. Like if they had died down there, it wouldn't have mattered to them. They wouldn't have lost any sleep over it because clearly this trailer wasn't that stable. The top was caving in. Like they'd given them just enough air to like barely breathe, and they'd had the forethought to give them water and stuff, but they hadn't like made sure that they had enough food and water to last more than like 3 days. Like there wasn't like after like 12 hours they were running out of food and water. They didn't have enough. So it's
Yeah.
like they obviously were like they didn't prepare just in case something went wrong because they
Right.
didn't really care if
Yeah.
something went wrong. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
like for me, because I'm like, I have empathy and a human heart, like if I were so desperate as to steal a bunch of children to get money, which I never would, but if I got back and I realized that my plan wasn't going to work because I literally couldn't call and make the ransom call, like you'd think that you'd want to take it back. Like you'd want to be like, oh dear heavens, they may not last long enough for us to get this ransom money. We should probably make sure they don't die.
Yeah, but
That's not what
sadly,
these people did.
anybody that's kidnapping children does not care. Because
Yeah,
if you care in the
obviously not.
first place, you're not going to do it. So,
Yeah. So, whatever. And like these children weren't physically like they had some scrapes and bruises and stuff, but they weren't like actually physically damaged. It was just psychologically horrifying for these kids. So, anyways, after like taking their little nap after the ransom call didn't work, um these three entitled garbage humans woke up the next morning and they saw on the news that their victims had freed themselves and were safe and that their plan went to the crapper while they were sleeping.
yeah.
So immediately they fled. And instead of like, you'd think at this point, you'd think that they'd try to like cover their tracks at all, get rid of any of the evidence that was in Wood's room. because literally everything was in there. Everything they needed to convict them was in his room. He didn't take any of that with him. He just like ran straight to Canada.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
they're obviously
All right.
not the brightest.
Really, they're not. So anyways, after all the men were arrested, they all pled guilty to the kidnapping for ransom and to robbery, but they wouldn't enter a guilty plea for infliction of bodily harm. And the DA wanted to charge them with that because it just doesn't seem like what happened. Like, I feel like what they did technically counts as kidnapping for ransom, but is like so much more than just kidnapping for ransom. Like, they
Yeah, it's
buried
not.
these kids alive in a trailer.
Yeah.
That doesn't
Yeah,
quite encompass
exactly.
that, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that's the best they could do, but they wanted to go further. That's why they did the infliction of bodily harm. And they tried to charge them with that. And they ended up trying them for that charge because they wouldn't plead guilty for it. And they were actually convicted and sentenced for the bodily harm charge, but it was overturned during an appeal because the appellate court found that the injuries that the children sustained didn't meet the standards set for what warrants as bodily harm under the law, which makes sense, but it sucks because
Whatever. Yeah.
yeah, because like
There
now,
was bodily harm.
yeah, it was their minds. That counts as bodily harm.
Well, but even
Like, I
then,
get
I mean, they
this.
were starved. They were, put in bad
Yeah,
conditions, where they couldn't, like, take care of themselves. Like, there was bodily harm done to them.
it
I
just
get it wasn't,
apparently,
like, fatal
yeah,
injury, but yeah,
exactly.
whatever.
And the reason that this really, really sucked was that because of this, the DA couldn't sentence them to life without parole. They had to be given the opportunity for parole. So that meant that every 1 or 2 years, they would be able to go in front of a parole board and potentially be let out of prison,
That's
which is just
ridiculous.
horrible. And this is a whole other rant, but I just feel like there should be a separate charge that exists that encompasses what, like, this kind of thing that these men did to these children. Like, they put these victims in a position where they definitely could have been hurt. They probably would have been if they hadn't taken the initiative to escape. Like, there should be something that's like an attempted bodily harm charge or something.
Well, I think
Because,
sometimes I wish people could be tried for intent, right?
yeah,
Like it was their intent basically to kill the kids. Who
yeah,
knows if they were going to release them? They could have gotten the ransom money and
exactly,
just left them in there so that there was no witnesses to who they were.
exactly.
You know what I mean? And so
It's wild.
it's like, yeah, with a lot of crimes, I wish, because like sometimes it's like people can only be tried for the attempted murder, but it's like, no,
Yeah.
their intent was
Attempted
to murder
murder is the
somebody.
worst.
Just because they didn't like get the job done like they wanted to doesn't mean they would have if they could have, or
Yeah, well,
wouldn't
that's the
have
thing is
if they
like
could have.
exactly. I feel like the attempted murder charge is one of like the things that I have the most issue with because like you just said, just because they didn't actually like go through with it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have if it had worked like they wanted it to. Like, that happens all the time where people like try to kill somebody and it doesn't work, especially with like poisonings and like we've talked about, like with the antifreeze thing. I feel like there was always an opportunity for her to be like, it was an attempted murder if you just stopped. But
Yeah,
like a lot of
exactly.
the time, it's like, but they wanted to do it. They would have done it. And I feel like that counts. I feel like that should count as a murder charge
Oh
because
yeah,
they would
I
have
think so.
killed them. It's
Yeah.
the same thing in this situation. Like, they, like, these kids, they would have died. How are they going to get them out of there? Like, how are they going to tell police where to go or how to get them out? Like, I just don't think that they really cared. And so it sucks that they had the opportunity to walk around as free men The victims, they returned home to their relieved parents. And the story was huge in this small town, but it actually became like an international story that was covered all around the world. One of the sad things was that Michael's role in their escape, namely that he was like the hero of the story, was kind of forgotten. And Ed Ray became like the hero of the story in this town. Um, a lot of the children
That's
tried
too
to tell
bad.
people that it was Michael that helped them get out, but the town kind of just took
Nah, he's
over and
14.
said
He's a
that Ed
14 year
Ray
old
was,
kid.
yeah, he's just a kid. Ed Ray was obviously the mastermind. Um, this messed with Michael's mental health because already all these kids were experiencing a lot of effects from the trauma that they'd been through.
Oh, yeah.
But because, like, on top of that, compounded with the fact that he was overlooked for all of the things that he'd done to help everybody during the situation, he felt bad that he felt like upset that he wasn't getting a lot of attention for it. He like
Yeah.
literally said he felt guilty for feeling bad that he wasn't getting, like, he wasn't being
Yeah, you
labeled a
would.
hero.
You would feel like that if you were a good person.
Yeah. But he said like it really messed with him, and it would have helped him to know that people like recognized what he did during that time. Would have given him a little bit more of like a purpose. And like he literally said, quote, "Before the kidnapping, I could see so much light ahead of me. I could see my future, but then after the kidnapping, I couldn't see anything." End quote. So he was just really
That's so
struggling.
sad.
I know.
He deserves
And
more than that.
he
He
really
saved
does.
20-something kids' lives.
He really did. He really did. Ed Ray helped. He definitely was like there and making sure things happened, but like it was Michael that took the lead on that. But by the time Michael was like 19 or 20, he was like fully mentally spiraled, and he was relying on alcohol and drugs, and he was just struggling to stay afloat because
No.
of all the effects from
No,
this.
Michael.
Yep. And eventually like things got better for him, but like he wasn't the only one of these children who was like profoundly traumatized from this experience.
Oh, yeah.
Um
They all were.
yeah. Larry Park, who was 6 at the time of the kidnapping, he said, quote, "I hated going to sleep because every night I was having nightmares." And his parents had been like, therapy wasn't really a thing back in the 70s. They weren't like
Yeah.
encouraging that sort of thing. So like they had some doctors basically telling the parents that when these kids had nightmares, they just needed to leave them alone and like let them deal with it on their own and not make a big deal out of it, and that the nightmares would just go away.
I don't think so.
That's not true. um, this Larry Park, he also said that his best friend, a girl that was also taken hostage, he just like watched her, like her personality totally changed. She became withdrawn and moody, and like she just faded away, he said. Like she lost herself. And this was the case with a lot of these kids, like a lot of them. So much so to the point that there was actually a study conducted on the kids in the aftermath of this situation. Like years later, they found like in the aftermath, like immediately after, these kids had panic attacks and nightmares about the kidnapping and about death in general. A lot of the kids had personality changes. They developed a lot of new fears, like fear of cars and the dark and the wind, and even things like dogs and kitchens and just like random stuff that they all of a sudden were like terrified of. Many of these kids even reported having like these traumatic symptoms lasting even 25 years after the initial kidnapping.
That's
So like this was
crazy.
like a lifelong struggle with basically
Yeah.
PTSD,
That doesn't surprise me.
and a lot of them used um, alcohol and drugs to try and like cope with stuff, which is really sad. And a lot of them were depressed, which makes sense. And some of these kids even grow up to do things that got them imprisoned for, quote, doing something controlling to somebody else, end quote. That's what the study said. So basically, life was not easy
Wow.
for these kids after this
Yeah.
incident at
Well,
all.
I can't imagine having to carry that around with you forever.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And this study actually, like, it started kind of, it became like a guide for treatment of young children who were victims of trauma. They like used this study to kind of like help learn more about how children react to trauma and how to treat it. So I guess that's one sort of good thing, I guess. They were able to learn from their experiences, but
Wow.
yeah. So for the next 46 years, there would be more than 60 parole hearings in total for these three men.
Oh, give me
So
a break.
that's great. That's more than one a year, just in case we're all missing that. um, one of the victims, Jody Heffington, we talked about her a little earlier. She went to almost every single one of these hearings, and she testified in some of them about her experience in an effort to keep these men in prison.
Wow, good
And
for her.
it worked for a long time, but despite her efforts and other victims' efforts, they had to sit by and watch when in 2012, 36 years after the kidnapping, Richard Schoenfeld was paroled at age 57. And then 3 years later, in 2015, James Schoenfeld was paroled at age 63. So that was not great. And then in 2016, um, Mr. Frederick Woods, the third kidnapper, he wasn't quite so lucky because they found out that he was running a gold mine and a car dealership from behind bars, which is illegal.
What? How? How do you even do that?
Well, the reason he was able to do
Okay.
that was because he'd inherited a trust fund worth about $100 million while he was behind bars. And he was just like living life to his fullest, as full as he could in jail. There was actually a lawsuit filed against him from the state because of him running businesses. Like, and they basically told him he couldn't do it anymore. So in
Gee.
2019, he was denied parole for the 19th time for all the
Sucks to
reasons I
suck.
just said. And
Sucks
also
to
because
suck.
he kept being found in possession of contraband, like cell phones and pornography. And he was continuing to try to minimize his crimes when he talked to people about what he had done. Like, no remorse. So he just kept sitting in prison for a while.
Good for him.
Another fun fact about Woods is that he got married 3 times while he was in prison. 3 whole times.
Wow. Who in the world thought
Don't
that was a
marry
good
people.
idea?
Don't marry people that are in prison. And also, while he was in prison, he bought a mansion that was about 30 miles away from where the prison was. So,
Why is he allowed to do that?
I don't know. Seems like he was like super remorseful about his crimes, you know? Like really, really cared about the damage he'd done.
It's
And
insane.
unfortunately, he wouldn't be behind bars forever. In March of 2022, he was recommended for parole, and even though the governor himself asked the board to reconsider, he was released on parole of August in 2022. And he was
Oh
70
my
years old
gosh.
when he was released. So, yeah, that's not great. That sucks for all of the victims that have had lifelong, lasting effects from what these 3 guys did for some money.
Well, yeah, and they'll continue to until they die. But
Yeah,
these
so
men
it
get to
seems
just live their life.
exactly. It only seems fair that these guys should have had to stay behind bars for as long as the impact of their crimes lasted, but that's not the case. It's one of those cases where like there's just like not a satisfying end. It's like, yes, the bad guys spent decades in prison or whatever, but that didn't take away from like the experiences that the victims had. And like in 2016, the victims, they filed a lawsuit to try to get compensation for what they went through. And they did get some, but not like a ton. And I don't know, this is just one of those cases where it just feels like the punishment didn't fit the crime for these guys. The children's like these people's lives were affected for decades and decades and decades. And it's like, great, these guys sat in prison for a few decades before they got to walk free, but it's like there should be a charge for psychological trauma or something that makes them sit behind bars or whatever. So, anyways,
wow, that's insane.
That is the 1976 Chowchilla Bus Kidnapping. Crazy stuff. Wow. Yep. So, tip of the week: don't ride the bus. Just in case. It's better to just avoid buses.
Just avoid being in public at all. Lock your doors, stay inside, become agoraphobic, and maybe you have a chance.
You might be safe.
I'm just kidding. Live life to the fullest, because you never know when today could be your last day.
Yeah. Don't live in fear. Just avoid buses for a little while. Just for your mental health. All right. Thanks, guys.
Stay frosty, y'all. Until next week.